joining the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba Brown Bag Speaker Series. So it's a real pleasure to be here, everybody. My role, I am from the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba. My role is as Treaty Education Lead. So for today's session, I'm going to talk about treaty education. I want to chat with you about treaty education, but I want to focus on how treaty education is founded, what is its curricular mooring. I want to chat a little bit about the idea of relationality as it applies to education and treaty education. I want to talk a little bit about how educators here in Manitoba can explore treaties and the treaty relationship with their students and place themselves into the story of treaty, using this treaty lens. And then I want to finish off our chat today talking about how treaty education fits within place-based or land-based education. So again, welcome everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I want to start off talking a little bit about treaty education from a curricular standpoint. Here in Manitoba, or across Canada or the United States or everywhere else, in curriculum development, when you design a program or when you deliver a program in your schools, whether it's kindergarten or grade 12, it is founded on the great ask, I call it. And by ask, I mean the acronym ASK, A-S-K. I'm going to start with the K first. K stands for knowledge. So no matter what course we're teaching, we are imparting knowledge to our kids. Again, whether we're in grade 2 or grade 11, right? It's the knowledge content of our courses that we engage with our students. Remember the ASK acronym. The S stands for skills. These are things that our learners do, that our kids in classes do. Skills could be something as tangible as basketball skills. If I was in a phys ed class, if I was learning about treaty education, skills might be communication skills, writing skills, the skills of the social studies. So each curriculum has its own skill set. That's the S. And the A stands for attitudes, values, the way we interact, and we can foster these with our students. So if this is the framework, if this is the curricular framework by which all curricula are founded, right, are moored, the great ask, A-S-K, I'd like to focus on right now and get us into a mindset into the K, and the K is knowledge. This is the knowledge content. In curriculum development, especially folks like Wiggins and McTighe in about the last 20 years have started to look at the idea of knowledge as big ideas, not the minutia, not the Google worthy, not the trivia, not that that's not interesting, but looking at the big ideas of how we can engage our learners in thinking, longitudinal thinking. So as they go through different grade levels and move forward, even as adults, what can they take? What is the nexus? What is the big ideas? Well, if we look at treaty education, what are the big ideas, the big knowledge content ideas? And they are based on 4. They are based on 4. So imagine if you were engaging your students, your learners in treaty education. Obviously, you're learning about treaties. But treaty education is a K-12 initiative. So it is meant to engage learners right from the beginning of their formal schooling here in Manitoba until they leave in grade 12. This is a large expanse. This is 13 years, right? So what do we want our kids to unpack, to understand about treaties and the treaty relationship? Well, let's look at the K. Let's look at the big ideas. The first one is traditional teachings. So it is imperative that our kids understand First Nations ways of knowing, First Nations languages. You don't have to be a language speaker. I've had the opportunity to be involved in treaty education here in Manitoba for the last 10 plus years. I live in Swampy Cree territory, but I am not a Cree speaker. But I've learned to value the language and see how it applies to an exploration of treaties. So the first big idea, the curricular mooring on which treaty education is founded, is traditional teachings. The second one, I think you're putting, 4 legs on a table, is relationships. At the heart of treaty, at the heart of understanding treaties is relationships. Relationships when newcomers first came to Turtle Island. Relationships between First Nations before Europeans were here. Relationships during the fur trade. I mean, this was the first coming together, especially here in Western Canada, after the Hudson Bay Company came in 1670. Traditional teachings, relationships via the numbered treaties beginning in 1871. Remember, there's relationships much preceding that. We're in a shorter area now from 1871 than preceded it. And relationships today. How is this treaty relationship that we are all in as Manitobans today affect our place on the ground in 2021? Traditional teachings, relationships. I said there's 4 big ideas. The other one that, again, and this is the curricular base, right, of treaty education, is having kids explore history. And by history, I mean Canadian history, because the history of treaty and treaty making and treaty relationships is Canadian history. I mean, often until, I would say, the early 2000s, and I'm a longtime teacher and curriculum developer, First Nations perspectives, Indigenous history, treaty history, treaty education was kind of pushed aside and siloed as a subset in Canadian history curriculum, in social studies curriculum. And we implore teachers at treaty education here in Manitoba to dovetail this into the narrative that is Canadian history. Treaty history is the history of Canada. It is not a siloed subset of Native studies. So we embed it throughout Manitoba curricula. So the curricular mooring, the base, the foundation by which treaty education, the content, traditional teachings, relationships, history, and I'm sure you could guess number 4, if there are 4, right? It's treaties. So we have learners explore treaties. Before 1871, the making of Treaty 1, much before European newcomers, I already mentioned during the fur trade. And even today, the treaty relationship is dynamic. It is ongoing. It is not relegated to history. It is underfoot as we speak right now. That is treaty education if you look at it from a content area. Remember, because in classes, kids uncover content. I mean, I'm a longtime history teacher, but I want to go back to the great ask that I started with. Kids are also sharpening skills. Kids are also honing and practicing and having opportunities to figure out who they are as learners, as individuals. They are honing, they are building, they are fostering attitudes, right? Values. I told you today that I wanted to talk about 4, large things. The first one is how treaty education is founded. So imagine these 4 big ideas, that interweave throughout students' studies here in Manitoba from kindergarten to grade 12. I mean, teaching is an active profession. So it is up to the professional, the teacher, right, to take this and embed it into their practice. That has always been the goal of treaty education, not to relegate it to a special topic, but to actively engage their learners with the curriculum that they're engaging in right now here in Manitoba. One of the focuses that I wanted to spend on today, though, with you folks, is that I wanted to talk about treaty education and specifically how treaty education is land-based education and how it ties to this concept of relationality. So in the education world, I mean, we have all studied theories and philosophies pertaining to education. I mean, if I harken back to my Bachelor of Education studies many years ago, we study guys like John Dewey, Piaget, I'm thinking Bloom's. I mean, we study philosophies in education, and probably one of the enduring philosophies that has been in education for a long time is Jean Piaget's, the idea of constructivist education. This is the constructivist pedagogy. So think of it this way. To construct something means to build, right? If I constructed a house, I built it. I built it from the framework. I had to plan it. I had to do all kinds of things to get it standing and staying as is. Well, that's really what constructivist education is. This is going to make sense soon. Hold on. As teachers, we build knowledge with students based on their prior experiences, we help them construct applicable knowledge. So whatever you're teaching them, you work with them to build it. Then it's meaningful because it's personalized. You work with kids to take knowledge. Remember, knowledge without action, knowledge without application, knowledge without construction is trivia. Not that there's anything wrong with trivia, but trivia is fleeting and it doesn't apply when you leave. I mean, when you leave grade 12. So this constructivist attitude of education informed treaty education pedagogy. And in about the last, decade or so, education philosophers have been talking about this idea of relationality. And to me, it fits with constructivist theory. Here's how it works. In treaty education, our goal is to take this knowledge building philosophy that teachers follow, the idea of constructivism, and move it a little bit even further along the line and have our kids explore treaties and the treaty relationship using the idea of relationality. So what is relationality? In my mind, it expands constructivism. And you want students now not only to build knowledge with their own experiences, with their own tactility, with their own hands, right? But you want them now to move this even further and have them apply this, and I chatted about this already, to First Nations traditional knowledge, to First Nations ways of knowing, to First Nations languages. I mean, this is at the core of understanding treaties, right, you guys? To connections to land, to connections to creation. And remember, treaty education, I want to pause a bit, is for all Manitoba students, not just Indigenous students. It is for all Manitoba learners. When we are constructing this knowledge, this idea of relationality, we want our learners to validate and understand the importance of storytelling. Remember, keep sliding this back to the 4 big ideas of treaty education, and especially the idea of story sharing. I mean, in our own communities, we have our own stories. I'm joining you today from the PAW, Treaty 5. We have our own treaty story underfoot here in the PAW. I'm in a Paskwiak Cree Nation traditional territory, Treaty 5. I mean, you may be joining me from all over the place. We have our own stories, and we want our kids to be invested in this storytelling, traditional storytelling, from knowledge keepers and people who live here, right? But we also want kids to be involved in story sharing. This is the constructivist part, right? Another thing that is imperative with this relationality, that it is all together when learning. Think of the big content ideas that I already shared with you, the knowledge. It is community-based. If we look at even further now, think of this as a massive interrelated web. Key to all of this knowledge, this constructivism, this relationality is respect, is mutual learning, is protocols, when learning from the land, when learning from knowledge keepers, when learning from elders, and the idea of reciprocity, that knowledge is a give and take. We give. I mean, even as a teacher, really, you are not the sage on the stage. Everybody used to talk about that, but really it's a bit cheesy, but we're the guide by the side. This is the foundation of treaty education, and that is our goal. We spent the last over a decade working with Manitoba teachers, helping them do the great work that they do. So my goal today, everybody, was to talk about how is treaty education set up. How is it founded? The big ask, I talked about it several times. We talked about the importance of relationships to land. So I want to talk a little bit more about that. Here in Manitoba, if we look at the numbered treaties began in 1871 in August with treaties 1 and treaties 2. In fact, we just had the sesquicentennial this summer. It was the 150th anniversary commemorations of the makings of Treaty 1 and Treaty 2. But treaties took place in spaces, and each treaty has a unique story that really takes place with your feet on the ground. So think about where you are right now in Manitoba. Whether you're in Winnipeg, whether you're in Thompson, whether you're in Swan River. I mean, you are in a treaty territory right now, no matter where you are here. You might could be in traditional territory that is the Dakota. There is a story underfoot. There is a story underfoot that is land-based. There is a story underfoot, and our goal at treaty education is to help teachers percolate, to bring those local land-based stories up to the front, to bridge the trivia, right? How can you place yourself into this? How can you place yourself? Well, as a longtime teacher, my background is teaching history and geography. And teachers ask me often, how can I place my students into the story of treaty? Well, I would say after they have the foundational knowledge of treaty making, the numbered treaties, the second step, folks, is to get outside. You can place your learners in. Not everybody lives next to the stone fort, you know, the Lower Fort Garry, where Treaty 1 was made in 1871. But you could place your kids into the story of treaty by sometimes just getting them outside in the playground, by looking at street signs, by looking at their local environment. What is missing? Is the story of treaty evident in the urban landscape? Is it there or is it not there? Again, I live here in the PAW, Pasquia Cree Nation. We are largely two communities separated by the Saskatchewan River. How does my local landscape tell me the story of treaty? What went on here? Make your kids the sleuths themselves. These are the skills of understanding treaty, right? So there are opportunity for kids to get outside. If you can't get outside, and I know there's always, as educators, there's the hoops to jump through to take kids outside of the classroom, and I respect that. You know, you can do digital tours. So we are really looking at treaty education about encouraging kids to get outside. This is how they can place themselves, you know, look at the skills, the attitude, and the knowledge, the crux of treaty, but how can they get out? Treaty education is multisensory, right? It relies on all of the senses. And this is one of our major goals. What does a treaty education lens look like? Now, I talked about a few things, and I told you today that I wanted to talk about what is treaty education's curricular basis. I wanted to talk about this concept of constructivism, of relationality. I wanted to talk a little bit about how learners can place themselves into the story of treaty, okay? Into the story of treaty. And I wanted to talk a little bit about assembling a treaty lens. So how can we encourage students to investigate treaty education using a treaty lens? Well, if I had to say as a longtime educator, what is a treaty lens? It really goes back to relationships. One of our key goals is for learners to see themselves in this treaty relationship, to find themselves on the land, to determine what treaty territory they live in, to go beyond the idea of the delineation of treaty territories, but also explore the idea of ancestral lands and traditional territories, which are different than treaty territories. I mean, treaty territories were surveyed and demarcated by government surveyors at the time of the making of the numbered treaties. Ancestral lands, traditional territories, supersede this. So there is a story that kids can investigate. A treaty lens, and I mentioned this earlier today, is looking at the language, whether you are in Dene territory, whether you are in Swampy Cree territory, as I am, whether you are in Anishinaabe territory, or whether there is a rich melding of territories. Have your students explore these languages, because these languages and the land are not divorced in Indigenous cultures. They are married in an important way, and this helps us tell the story of treaty. My goal today, folks, was to look at a few things. One was treaty education as land-based education. One was, treaty education's curricular foundation. One was the concept of relationality. So the last thing I want to talk about before we end our session today, the last thing I really want to talk about today is how treaty education is land-based education. If you were to begin or continue, as many Manitoba educators are right now, embedding treaty education into your professional practice, into your classrooms, the logical entry point is the social studies from a curricular viewpoint, right? Social studies here in Manitoba are offered from, as you know, kindergarten to grade 11. They are mandatory here in Manitoba. Manitoba social studies becomes a pure geography course. And in grade 11, it is Manitoba's flagship history course, Canadian history. But I challenge you, and I know you're doing it already, is to step a little wee bit aside from the social studies bookends. Step a little bit aside and think about land-based education, place-based education. And I chatted about this already, involving kids in the story of treaties by engaging them in outside. Get outside. Again, right now it's fall. We are ebbing into winter before you know it. There are opportunities everywhere. If you engage kids in outdoor learning, place-based learning, land-based education, what you really are doing is engaging them in the story of treaty. Because if you recall, I told you the treaty education had 4 foundational pieces. One was traditional teachings, right? Understanding the worldviews of First Nations people and the intricate links to the land in creation and how they are all one explains the mindset when treaties 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 adhesion, 6, 10 here in Manitoba were made. This gives kids the opportunity when they leave our schools or when they engage in treaty education to make it a robust, meaningful, constructivist exploration of treaties and the treaty relationship. My goal today, everybody, was to do a bit of a chat about treaty education. Before I conclude, I want to tell you a little bit about treaty education here in Manitoba. Treaty education began about 11 or 12 years ago. It was called the Treaty Education Initiative. It began in 2009, 2010. After extensive writing and piloting, it became a part of Manitoba's curricular landscape. It's been around for a good 10 years. We have worked now here in Manitoba with over 7,000 Manitoba teachers. We've been offered training similar to today's. We spend usually 2 days together. We have been in every school division here in Manitoba. We have worked with faculties of education. We've also had the wonderful opportunity to work with several informal education sectors, such as Canada's history, Canadian geographic, and whatnot. I encourage you from my desk here at Treaty Education to explore treaties and the treaty relationship with your students. I am encouraging to get out of the classroom, to have your kids slip on that treaty lens so they can see themselves in the story. A treaty is made up of partners. A treaty is made, it's a relationship, and the partners are all of us, the Crown, First Nations, and the Creator. We are living this relationship today, and we're living in an era where we hear lots about reconciliation. I mean, we hear constantly here in 2021 here in Canada. Well, in my mind, reconciliation is founded in several things, but one is honoring these relationships that were made 150 plus years ago, and giving our learners, our kids in our classrooms, the opportunity to explore this relationship from their desks, from their hearts, from their heads and from the land. And with that, folks, I want to thank everybody. Thank you for having me here today at the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba Brown Bag Speakers Lunch Series. I think I muffed that up a bit. My name is Connie, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, everybody.